So today we're diving into a really fascinating idea, one that kind of challenges a fundamental belief most of us have about creativity. And it all starts with a very simple but very powerful question.
I mean, really think about that for a second. You've heard of them, right? The golden ratio, the rule of thirds, the three-act structure and storytelling. We're surrounded by these things that feel like guidelines for success. But are they actually rules?
And the answer this analysis gives? It's a big, resounding, absolutely not. The core argument here is super direct and, honestly, pretty provocative. It says that not only are there no rules for making great art, but the very idea of a rule completely contradicts what art is all about.
Okay, so that's a pretty bold claim, right? To really get our heads around it, we have to start by tackling what this analysis calls art's biggest, most persistent myth.
Here's the core logic. A rule, by its very nature, what does it do? It limits things. It defines. It basically puts up a fence. But the whole point of art, according to this argument, is to expand possibilities, to knock down fences, and to explore what's boundless. So a rule for art, it's basically a paradox, a total contradiction.
So if things like perspective and harmony and all that stuff we learn about, if they aren't universal laws, then what in the world are they? Well, let's pull back the curtain and unmask these so-called rules. The idea here is that these artistic laws are really just temporary solutions. They're habits that were created by artists at a specific time, in a specific place, to solve a specific problem they were facing. They aren't some commandments handed down from the heavens. They're just conventions that happened to catch on and eventually became traditions. And history shows us this pattern so clearly. You look at the Renaissance, and the hot new rule was all about mathematical perspective. Then, fast forward to the Enlightenment, and it was all about narrative clarity. And then modernism comes along, and its main rule was basically to reject the old rules of realism. See? Every era builds its own set of conventions, and then the next one comes along and has a great time tearing them all down. And this constant cycle of creating something just to destroy it later, well, that leads us to the most powerful part of this whole argument, that artistic progress isn't just a slow evolution. It's actually an act of rebellion. Just take Impressionism, for example. For centuries, the classical rule was to represent light and form with almost photographic accuracy. But the Impressionists? They rebelled. They said no. What really matters is the subjective feeling of the light, that fleeting sensation. And by directly violating the old rules, they changed art forever. And hey, this isn't just about painting. For most of history, the rule in music was that it came from acoustic instruments, things that mimicked natural sounds. Then along comes electronic music, which just shatters that rule by creating entirely new sounds from pure electricity, sounds that had never even existed in nature. A total rebellion. So you see the pattern, right? And here's the crucial point. If artists had always just followed the established musts, art would have just stopped. It would have stagnated. We just have shinier, more polished versions of the exact same things. The real innovation, the stuff that actually pushes culture forward, is born from breaking those rules.
But wait a minute, does this just mean that anything goes? If there are no rules, are we just left with, a creative free-for-all? This is where the analysis throws in a really important twist. Because here's the key distinction. The analysis warns that just mindlessly rejecting every single convention, well, that can lead to work that's empty, superficial. There's a huge difference between intentionally breaking a rule to make a point and just being completely unaware that any rules ever existed in the first place. So true artistic freedom isn't about thoughtless chaos. It's about a conscious choice. It's about understanding the tradition, understanding those so-called rules, and then deliberately choosing to defy them for a specific, expressive purpose. That's where the real power is. So after all that, where does this leave us? Let's take a look at the final verdict from this analysis. Okay, this right here might be the single most important distinction in this whole thing. There absolutely are rules for the tools of art, for the technical craft. There's a right way and a wrong way to mix paint to get a certain color, or how to compress a sound file without losing quality. But those are rules of technique. For the art itself, the actual act of expression, this analysis is crystal clear. There are none. Because at the end of the day, when we try to impose these universal laws on art, we stop treating it as art. We reduce it to a technical problem, like a kind of engineering where you just follow a blueprint to get a predictable result.
And that, this analysis concludes, is the very opposite of what art is. Which leaves us with this final, really cool question to chew on. If the truest, most authentic tradition in art is the act of breaking with tradition, what current rules are just waiting to be shattered? What rebellion is brewing right now that's going to define the art of tomorrow?